Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well. All right, nice to meet you.
It is very, very, very good to meet you too. I was actually just listening to a podcast with you and like taking notes, and I'm just so grateful for your voice.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. It's all very overwhelming, obviously.
I have like so much like I want to talk to you about. So much context that I think is important. And obviously feel free to also like navigate this conversation to cover anything that you want to talk about and anything that you want to say.
Okay.
Um, I want to read you something that I wrote. This was probably like this. I think this was 2 days after the terrorist attack. I wrote, "Never in my years as an activist have I seen other activists, upon seeing footage of little girls being killed and dragged through streets, immediately find the burning need to go on the internet and justify their deaths. Oh, here are all the reasons that girl was burned alive." For complete clarity, the only reason you do this is because you have been made to believe that the killing of Jews can even be justified, because every civilization has taught that the life of a Jew is less valuable than your own. And then I kept going, and my caption was, "Everyone becomes a historian when they see a dead Jew." Um, and I think the sentiment for me behind that was like, I've never understood why when there is a killing or an attack of Jewish people, there's always a because after it, in however anyone discusses it and reports it. And I was like, is there a good reason for something like that? Is there a reason? Like, do you, like, why? I don't understand why we're talking about land disputes within 24 hours of a massacre like this. Like, what? Does it matter? Does that impact whether that terrorism was okay? Was that justify it? Would it make you feel better? Like, I couldn't process the conversations that I was hearing. I couldn't even understand the relevance after a terrorist attack because I don't remember ever having those conversations after 9/11. And and of course I was sent I was sent your book. And it really like had so profoundly impacted me. And so I don't know if that is like a good place to start, but obviously you wrote this incredible book, which I would love for you to maybe even explain why you did. And, now in the context of this, because I know you've talked about many different incidents, including one in New Jersey where you're from or are now, um, how this is different or actually similar.
I mean, it's all the same people want to kill us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I would like, I would, it would, I wish we were talking about, like, Hamas is playing four-dimensional chess. Yeah, they're not playing four-dimensional chess. They want us to die. This is what we call victim blaming. This is a very, very common feature of anti-Semitism going back to ancient times.
Can you
Um,
explain?
yeah, so I mean, like every, you know, the Holocaust was because we stabbed the Germans in the back, right? And we,
Yeah.
somehow caused them to lose the First World War, right? I mean, like, this is literally. I mean, I was amazing. I was just so I have a piece I wrote for the New York Times that's coming out that's sort of placing this in the context of like historical pogroms, and I was sort of just going through fact checking for them and looking at the documentation from the pogroms in during the Russian Civil War, which was 1918 to 1921, and in which over 100,000 Jews were brutally murdered, and you probably never even heard of it,
Yeah. Of
right? Like who even remembers when 100,000 Jews were brutally murdered? Like,
course.
whatever, right? That's like
That's just
Tuesday.
another one.
And what was amazing is I'm reading through these documentation just because I'm fact checking this for the New York Times. New York Times didn't feel the need to fact check a giant headline about how Israel bombed a hospital in Gaza, which turned out not to be true, but okay, putting that over here. Um, I'm fact checking this for them, and I'm reading through, and then I get to the page in this testimony where it's all about how, well, of course we had to kill all the Jews because they were Bolsheviks.
Wow.
I mean, like obviously, like they could just have not been Bolsheviks, and then this wouldn't have been an issue.
Wow.
So I mean, like in literally every single one of these incidents, there's that.
Wow.
And it completely doesn't matter what the Jews do in any of these instances because it's like, oh, they took their land, and then but like before that, it was like, you know, these people are perverse because they don't have their own land.
Yes, of course.
Yes,
Well,
that's
and
like the root was cosmopolitans. Like it's literally it is so irrelevant what Jews do in this context. And that is the dynamic where it's like we're blaming the Jews for their own, for attacking the Jews.
so
So
I
this
mean,
is very, very old.
can we maybe go back a little bit to when you wrote your book? And I know that that was not something you were intending to write, and it wasn't necessarily like what your background was in, but can you explain why you wrote that book?
Yes. So yes, as you said, this wasn't, I wrote this book like to spite myself. I'd been publishing books for 20 years before that. All my books before that deal with Jewish are they're novels, and they deal with Jewish history and culture and contemporary American Jewish life and from a variety of perspectives. And I'm also a scholar of Hebrew and Yiddish literature. I teach those subjects at, I've taught them in a bunch of different universities. And it was always really important to me to like define Judaism, Jewish culture and Jewish civilization from the inside. I never wanted to write about anti-Semitism. So the origin story of this book is in 2018, I started to think about this differently. Um, and it started with something really small. Smithsonian Magazine, General Interest Magazine, they asked me to write a long form, like a long essay for them about Anne Frank. And I got this assignment and I just thought, oh God, like I really don't want to write this like long pious essay about Anne Frank for Smithsonian that's then going to be disseminated in doctors' offices across America. Um, but then, the normal thing to do would have been to turn that assignment down, but, I'm a writer, so I'm not a normal person. So I'm like, this is interesting. Why don't I want to write about this? Why does this make me uncomfortable? And that was when I remembered this news story of something that had happened at the Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam that same year in 2018. And so people who've read the book already know this story. This is about a young Jewish man who worked at that museum, and the museum would not allow him to wear his yarmulke to work. They made him hide it under
No
a
part of my
baseball hat.
brain could understand that when I read that.
Well, this is the dynamic you need to understand. So, yes, the museum made him hide his yarmulke under a baseball hat. He then appeals this decision to the board of the museum. The board of the museum then deliberates for 6 months and then finally relents and lets him wear his yarmulke to work. And as I put it in the book, 6 months is a very long time for the Anne Frank Museum to ponder whether or not it was a good idea to force the Jew into hiding. So, I had read this news story and then I was like, did I dream this? Did this really happen? I look it up again and then I realized I discovered something else. And this is, I think, particularly telling for right now. Something equally stupid happened at the same museum a few months earlier in 2017 when
Yeah.
visitors noticed something weird about the audio guides. It's a big international museum. They have 15 languages for their audio guide. And there's that audio guide display where it says English and there's a British
And there's
flag
a
and it says
flag next to it.
France and there's a French flag until you get to Hebrew. Hebrew, no flag. No
Mm.
flag. So at that point I'm like, these are PR mishaps, but they're not mistakes. Because,
Mm.
the museum's mission is to show everybody the Jews' humanity. The humanity of the nice Jews, right? The dead ones. Not the gross ones doing disgusting things like, I don't know, practicing Judaism or living in Israel where half the world's Jews live. And I mean, at that point I went back to Smithsonian and I was like, yeah, I will write this for you. And the first line of
That
that
was
piece
the
is,
first line,
yes,
right?
exactly, is people love dead Jews, living Jews not so much. Here's the thing though. I thought I was just getting this out of my system. Like I published this, sent it to the doctor's offices, and I was like, I'm done. The problem is, it was like just a few days after that piece came out that there was the shooting at the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh.
Wow.
And it was within hours of that attack, the New York Times calls me and was like, would you like to write about dead Jews? I mean, they didn't say it like that, but that was basically what they wanted. It was like, another like pious article about like, oh, isn't this sad that Jews died? And I took that assignment, but then 6 months later, there's a shooting at this shul in San Diego, and it happens again, and the like New York Times calls me again, and as I said, I'm like the go-to person for the emerging literary genre of synagogue shooting op-eds. And I'm like, I didn't apply for this job. And at that point, like, it sort of hits me. I'm like, this is the only thing that non-Jewish readers want to hear about.
Wow.
That was when I sort of realized that. And, at that point, I was like, I noticed that how uncomfortable it made me to be asked to write these pieces and how I sort of felt this obligation to write them because I'm thinking, like, if I don't say yes to this assignment, who are they going to ask next? Is that person going to be a
Sure.
bozo? I sort of almost felt like I'm protecting the public from the person they might ask if I say no. But the thing is that, like, at that point, I said, like, this is so uncomfortable. One thing that I know from my work as a writer for 20 years writing novels is that the uncomfortable moments are always where the story is, because that's when you're
Mm.
about to learn something that you would never learn otherwise. The things that you've been avoiding, this is what we've been avoiding. And so I then dive into this, and so the book is like, it takes you around the world, and it goes to lots of different places and lots of different periods in time, and sort of shows this dynamic. And here's what the dynamic is: people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel good about themselves, and then the other side of that is that living Jews have to erase themselves in order to gain public respect.
Okay, so that I want to talk a lot about too, because
Yes.
I experience this around me all the time, right? Like people are very apologetic for their privilege when they're Jewish, and they're like, I understand, and I'm like, what are you talking? I mean, what, and kind of like forget everything that we have gone through for I don't even know how many years. Um,
Gone through, like, now.
yes, I just mean like all of us, right? This
Yeah.
generational trauma that every single one of us
We're like
carries.
governing in a lockdown.
And I don't, and I remember going to the Academy Museum and being like, I'm sorry, what just happened here? And this like, and
That's the
everyone
living
just
Jews
does like
erasing themselves.
we
Yes.
don't say, hey, the United Nations is very, very biased against Israel and Jews. Hey, Human Rights Watch is very biased against Jews and Israel. We don't say these things, and I think part of it is like me growing. My husband's dad escaped Nazi Germany. Like they came to the U.S. and like got a Christmas tree, and he named all of his kids like very, very Christian sounding names. Like my family was very much like, don't rock the boat, don't say anything, you're going to upset people, and I think a lot of us were raised with that of like, if they notice us, they'll kill us. So don't say
I mean,
anything.
that's been a strategy. So that has been a strategy for Jews in the diaspora in a lot of different periods and time, and a lot of different times and places. That has been a strategy, a survival strategy for Jews in the diaspora, is to erase themselves in order to gain not even just public respect, but safety. I have a chapter in my book about what I call the legend of Ellis Island, which is about a story that a lot of American Jews heard in their families about how, there was this bumbling cork at Ellis Island that changed our family's last name from something super Jewish sounding to something super not. It never happened. No one at Ellis Island ever changed anyone's names. Um,
Wow.
and this isn't like my amazing research. They announce this when you go on the tour of Ellis Island National Park. So, but what we do have are tens of thousands of court records of American Jews going to court and changing their own names. And this is like after the mass migration to Ellis Island. This is like in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. And the reason they're changing their names is because they're staring down American anti-Semitism. Today we talk about anti-Semitic incidents, but in 1940 it wasn't an incident. It was like, you can't get a job, you can't rent an apartment, you can't stay in a hotel, you can't go to college. I mean, it's like, these are life-limiting things. These people were just, I mean, that's a strategy of self-erasure, which is like required for you to, flourish in this country. So, and I think that different Jewish communities from different places have incorporated those strategies, which sometimes have worked and sometimes haven't. The problem is one of these strategies requires us to erase ourselves. And that's been going on for thousands of years. I have a chapter in my book also where I talk about the Hanukkah story. I talk about Purim anti-Semitism and Hanukkah anti-Semitism, which I name after these Jewish holidays that celebrate triumphs over them. Purim
Wow.
anti-Semitism based on the biblical book of Esther about this, attempted genocide in the Persian Empire in ancient times. That's sort of like basically like what Hamas is doing. Like there's like big bad guys who are coming to kill all the Jews, and there's no subtlety, and they're not playing four-dimensional
Totally.
chess. Like they just want to kill people, and they said it out loud, and here we are, they're killing people. Hanukkah anti-Semitism, as I describe it, is about what happens in the Hanukkah story, where there's this Hellenized, Greek cultural empire that takes over ancient Judea, and they're like, well, our culture is obviously better than yours, and why wouldn't you want to be part of our culture instead of your, pathetic, sad, loserly culture? And at first, the Jews of Judea are like, we can go along with this. So one of the things they do is they build, and this is part of that like living Jews erasing themselves dynamic, is what I'm calling Hanukkah anti-Semitism. They built a
Mhm.
gymnasium in Jerusalem for the Greek games. And then they had to recruit teenage Jewish boys to perform, to play in these Greek games. And so if you've ever been in an art museum, you might recall that Greek athletics were played in the nude. These teenage Jewish boys had their circumcisions reversed so they could participate in these Greek games.
Wow.
What's amazing to me about that story is like no one's making them do that at that point. That was just
Mm-hmm.
what you had to do to be a person who mattered in that society. And it's only 5 years later that that society outlaws circumcision. And, this sort of self erasure is like whatever is, that's it, the goal is still to destroy Jewish civilization, but the way it's done is not by
But
necessarily
why?
killing
Like,
people,
why? I
it's by
actually
making
don't.
Jews not be Jewish.
But like, why? Why? Why does everybody want? Like, why? What is the goal? There's like eight of us left. Like, what is what? Why?
There's a larger question, I think, underneath your question, which is the persistence of this. There's a book by the University of Chicago historian David Nierenberg called Anti-Judaism, the Western tradition. And his argument in that book, which spans like thousands of years, is that all of these societies have defined themselves against what they call Judaism. I mean, which
What?
usually has very little to do with actual Judaism, but it's like what makes them who they are is that they are not Jewish. And for them, and basically the idea is that, and I don't think this is his quote, and I'm going to forget whose quote this is. It's not that all Jews are evil, it's that all evil is Jewish. This is how
Oh,
these societies have defined this. And I actually think that there's, and this I cannot prove, but I actually think there's a reason underneath it, like why they picked the Jews as being their incarnation of evil and the thing they need to eradicate. I actually think there's a real reason behind this, which is that Jews are the people who introduced the idea of moral responsibility in
mm.
Western civilization. Before that, you have stuff like Hammurabi's Code, but that's all like it's tied to a rule. It's tied to a ruler. It's not tied,
Yeah.
it's tied to some human who's like in charge. And this idea that I mean, and all the idea of rejecting tyranny is inherent to Judaism. So, we think of Judaism as first monotheism. Monotheism means we reject idolatry. Well, what
Yeah.
does it mean to reject idolatry? It's not about not praying to a statue. Other in the ancient Near East, there are these peoples that had all these many gods, and one of their gods is the dictator, right? I mean, that was in ancient Egypt, like the pharaoh's a manifestation of the
Yeah.
god. And so when the Jews come around and say we don't bow to idols, what they're actually saying is we don't bow to tyrants.
Mm.
So Judaism represents this idea, which was radical in the ancient world, of moral responsibility, responsibility to something that's not an earthly ruler, and ultimately it represents a rejection of tyranny. And people really freaking hate responsibility. Nobody wants to be told that something is their fault. Nobody wants to be told that actually not only is this your fault, but also like you could fix it. People really hate responsibility. And so I think that, I mean, one of the ways I put it in my book is I say that Jews are like civilization's nagging mothers, loathed in life and loved once they are safely dead. I mean, the reason the Talmud is 3,000 pages long is because it includes everybody's opinions, not just the people who won the argument. Like, we never agree on anything, right? And
Yeah.
that's what Jewish life is all about, the disagreements. And machloket l'shem shamayim, like an argument for the sake of heaven, the idea that, like, being with other people means respecting differences. That's another idea that's very hard for people to tolerate. So, but all these things are so, like, below the surface. They're so sort of, like, deep. They're, like, deep in the bottoms, in the, like, sort of, like, the muck at the bottom of Western civilization that, like, people can't even, like, process all this going through it. But I think that when you see people sort of claiming to talk about human rights while justifying, the murder of babies, I mean, I think that part of where that's coming from is this idea that, like, there has to be this universal concept that we all agree with, and Jews reject that idea, right? I mean, there's this, like, what is the idea of Judaism on one foot, right? When the Rabbi Hillel
Yeah.
is some pagan approaches him, it's like the most famous story in the Talmud, and he says, "Teach me the whole Torah while I'm standing on one foot." And Hillel says, "What is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor." That's the whole Torah. Everything else is commentary. And people often say, "Oh, it's just like the golden rule, do unto others." It's not like the golden rule, because the golden rule, "Do unto others as you would have them do to you," is making this arrogant assumption that what other people want is the same as what you want. It's
Right.
not allowing the other person the dignity of an integrity
Wow,
of
that's
them
amazing. I've
being
never heard that
different from
before.
you. Like,
Yeah.
maybe my favorite band isn't your favorite band.
Right.
right? I mean, like, and allowing that other person the space to not be you. The reality is people just want to blame their problems on somebody else.
But how does that manifest? Like, putting aside the trolls and the bot farms and all of the misinformation, I can't understand as like a human being, as an activist, like we saw what happened, and like people that I think are really smart and really caring and have stood on, have stood up for so many marginalized groups, like just couldn't say, hey, that terrorist attack was bad. Those
Like,
victims
it's
deserve
bad to murder
dignity.
babies.
Yes,
Yeah.
those victims deserve dignity, and those hostages should be released. Like, I can't understand, like, what prevents someone from saying that.
Do I really need to spell this out for you?
Yeah, I swear. I feel like I need to, like, I
They don't
wanted to
think Jews
do
are
studies
people.
on people because I couldn't
They don't
understand.
think Jews are people.
But what does that mean? Like, actually, what does
Because
that
there is
mean?
this deep thing in Western civilization where they think that we're like the incarnation of evil, and they don't even know that this is what they're tapping into. This is so damn old. This is so damn old that
Is it because they think that
people
there
can't
can?
even see it. People can't even see it. That they've been poisoned to think that if Jews do something, it is evil. They don't. People can't even see it. But I mean, this is so deep in. And so then what happens is we also end up erasing Jewish civilization when telling those stories like, oh, look at this kid who was just like you and me. It's not like, oh, look at this kid who was a chassid, which is actually like the majority of Holocaust victims. So there's this erasure of Jewish life, and the result of that, and what's amazing to me about that is very similar to what has happened, what non-Jewish societies have done with Jewish stories for thousands of years, which is like you take a Jewish experience and you extract it and basically take it away from the Jews and say that it happened to you.
Will you explain the Anne Frank quote? Because that was a really incredible, powerful example of this.
Yes, exactly. So, probably the most famous line in the Diary of Anne Frank is when she writes, "I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart." And this is, of course, the line that's like, it's on the book jacket, it's on the museum wall, it's on your test when you read this book in ninth grade. And, the reason that people like that line is because it's inspiring. But what we mean by inspiring is that it's flattering, right? Because it makes us feel forgiven for lapses in our civilization that lead to piles of murdered girls, right? And if a murdered girl said this, like, it must be true. And I have to say that there is something very inherent in Western society where this is a familiar story of like there's this murdered Jew who's offered us absolution from our sins. The problem with that is that the reality is so much simpler. Anne Frank wrote that line about people being truly good at heart 3 weeks before she met people who weren't.
Wow.
Because 3 weeks after she wrote that line, she's arrested, she's deported to Auschwitz, and guess what? She met people there who weren't truly good at heart. But that's not in the book. Guess why? Because she's murdered. But, like, you have to dump that whole reality. I mean, it's like, who is she writing about people who are truly good at heart? Like, who is she spending the last 2 years with? Her family. And the extremely rare individuals who are helping her family. Like, that's who she knew. We don't hear the part of the story where she met the people who really weren't good at heart. So the problem is, like, yeah, you have to dump and erase that whole reality in order to teach this story, and then you turn this into like this universalizing inspirational tale, which is a lie.
Yeah.
It's a lie, and that's the lie that's being taught to people. And what I think is amazing is, like I said, this universalization of a Jewish experience, or even an inversion of a Jewish experience, like, oh, this thing that happened to the Jews, it really happened to us, or to all of us. And then it's like, oh, there are people here who are still claiming to be Jews, like, oh, they're irrelevant. I mean, the church did this for thousands of years, right? We're the new Israel. Islam did this, right? Like, we have the true prophecy. The Jews have some corrupted prophecy, and we have the true prophecy. I mean, it's like this sort of a massive
Yeah.
appropriation of Jewish experience is like almost like bedrock to these civilizations in which we live, and it does persist even though people may not. No one's consciously thinking of it this way.
So like so when I used to have this conversation with people, I was like, I literally would ask, what is it? Like, what do you think is the inability for people to feel empathy and compassion for what Jews have gone through for thousands of years? right? Like, and not just like in the olden days, like today, like I went through it. Like, I don't understand. And I would hear things like, again, I understand your point that we don't invite this and it is not on us. But it's like, oh, Jews are rich. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Jews control the media. Jews, and then they recite all of these tropes. And I don't know that people understand how internalized these tropes are
I mean,
in,
this is like a mental virus in Western civilization.
yeah.
Like you even said, like, though, oh, Jews are rich, Jews have too much power, Jews have too much privilege, Jews are overrepresented. You know how damn old that one is?
Yeah.
It's in the book of Exodus. No, it is like, why does I mean, and I'm not claiming this is like a historical, historically accurate, but what I'm saying is this dynamic is already, people are talking
Yeah.
about it since ancient times, because why does the Pharaoh enslave the Jews in the book of Exodus? The Hebrews are too numerous.
Yeah.
They're overrepresented. And because of Joseph, who's come to Egypt and sort of, had this position of power as the second in command of Egypt, the Jews have too much power, too much privilege, and they're overrepresented, and that's why he enslaves them. And then starts killing their babies.
So when you think about all of this in the context of like, there's only one country whose existence is questioned still every day, not a coincidence that it's Israel. Do you think that fundamentally anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism?
I mean, I don't see how you can avoid that at this point. I want to say a couple things about that. Yeah, is there some theoretical plane where you could be some kind of anarchist who like doesn't believe that there should be countries and therefore you're an anti-Zionist? Okay, fine. Then you probably don't want a Palestinian state either. If you don't believe there should be countries and like, we all should be just living in a happy whatever. Okay. But I mean, here's the thing that I speak in a lot of college campuses, and there's always somebody who asks this question, like, can't I be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic? And my response to that is, I don't know if you're aware of the origins of the slogan you just shared with us. It's from the Bolsheviks in 1918. That's the origins of the slogan. So in 1918, the Bolsheviks have overthrown the Russian Tsar, and they're waging civil war in the former. They're trying to basically take control of the former Russian Empire. They need the Jews of the former Russian Empire, it was like 2 million Jews, on their side to win this civil war. And so they create what were called the Yevsektia. These are the Jewish sections of the Communist Party. And the purpose of these Yevsektia, these Jewish sections of the Communist Party, is to spread Marxist or Bolshevik propaganda among these Jewish masses, as they used to say in communist language. And their slogan in 1918 is, "We are not anti-Semitic, we are just anti-Zionist." Did you catch that this is in 1918? This is 30 years before the creation of the State of Israel. It's probably not about Netanyahu. And what's really amazing about this is that, so in the course of, and by the way, also, we're not just anti-Zionist, also we're Bolsheviks, so we're also anti-religious. So we love Jews, you just can't practice Judaism or support Zionism or study Hebrew, but otherwise we love you. And of course, in the process of not being anti-Semitic and only being anti-Zionist, they of course managed to persecute, imprison, torture, and murder tens of thousands of Jews. Later, the people who are on these Yevsektia committees end up being purged themselves because, what do you know? It turned out they were all Zionist spies. And then decades later, the Soviet Union exports this slogan to their client states in the developing world. Including, of course, the Arab world, and also South America, and also, supporters in progressive circles in North America. And I say, and that's how the slogan came to you, sitting here at UC Santa Cruz in 2023. And people just aren't aware of this. Like, there's a paper trail for this. That this has been a long campaign that started with the Soviet Union. So, I mean, and it's not, like, that's how old it is. This whole, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. But that whole idea, that's like what I call Hanukkah anti-Semitism, which is this idea that, we love Jews, but we get to decide how you get to be Jewish. because the other way I sometimes will present this to people is I say, when college students will ask me this, and they're not even asking like to heckle me, they're just asking me,
Yeah.
can't you be, anti-Semitic without being anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic? And I say like, yeah, maybe there's this theoretical planet where you're an anarchist or something, okay, but I say let's look at the reality. Also, let's just look at the reality among American Jews. I think it's over 80% of American Jews identify as Zionists, in whatever that means to them. But basic definition, believing in the right of Jews to have self-determination in their ancestral homeland. The end. Whatever that looks like to you, whether that includes a Palestinian state, a side by
Yeah.
side, whether that's whatever. There's many versions of that, but over 80% of American Jews that is believe in this. So this is a non-Jewish society editing how Jews get to be Jewish, and that is a form of anti-Semitism. It's not we want to kill all the Jews. It's like we want to keep all the Jews as long as they stop being Jewish. And there's many, many versions of this throughout Jewish history. I mean, there's Spanish Inquisition, and I mean many, many versions of this.
It's mind-blowing. There was something else you had said that I thought a lot about, which is, and I caught it because I've said it, which is this idea of where I'm like, and I don't even know why people don't have compassion for Jews because, like, if they're going to kill us, then they're going to come and kill you. And I've like literally just said this, like, oh, you think the person's just going to come and blow up my kid at school and not your kid? Like, if they're coming for me, then they're going to come for you next. And that we, have somehow, and your response to this was so enlightening.
So, oh right, so this is this like first they came for the Jews kind of thing, where they're like, the reason you should care about anti-Semitism is because like, it will affect other people. What I pointed out in my book is that think about how much you have to denigrate yourself to
Yeah.
make that argument, right? Because what you basically are saying is like everyone should care when Jews are murdered or maimed because it might be an ominous sign that later real people might get attacked.
And I guess like in this context, I would love for you, if you don't mind, and I don't know how much longer I have you, so I want to be mindful of your time as well, but um, just this idea about how you write how, Jews can never just die and be remembered and mourned as victims. Um, I thought that was really, really powerful.
Yeah, so this idea of victim blaming, right? That somehow the Jews brought this upon themselves. It's inherent in the way we talk about almost every anti-Semitic attack. And at the end of my book, I talk about lethal attacks on the Hasidic communities in New York and New Jersey that were happening right before the pandemic. I mean, unfortunately, there have been many attacks on the Hasidic community since then. It's like I feel like I feel like I could write a sequel to this book like every day of the year, for whatever new thing has happened. But these were attacks on Hasidic communities in New York and New Jersey, which is actually one of them was quite near where I live. I live in New Jersey, and it was at a kosher grocery store in Jersey City, where these are people murdered in a supermarket.
Yeah.
There was another attack in Muncie, New York, which is a town of upstate New York town with like a large Hasidic population. This is actually really gruesome, similar to what we saw last, in the recent attacks in Israel. Was like somebody walked into this crowded Hanukkah party with a 4-foot machete and just started slashing people. And what I found amazing is I read all of the news coverage of those attacks. I could not find a news story that didn't say something derogatory about the community being attacked while reporting the attack. So, for example, in the Jersey City case, every single article about those attacks talked about how these Hasidic Jews were gentrifying a minority neighborhood,
Oh my
which
God.
is interesting for a lot of reasons. Number one, these people were actually fleeing gentrification. They got priced out of Brooklyn. That's why they're in New Jersey. I mean, that's why a lot of people are in New Jersey. Number one. Number two, these people are highly visible members of the country's top hate crime target, according to the FBI. I mean, these aren't like, white hipsters. Number two. Number three, is there this murderous rage against gentrification where people are, walking into cool coffee shops with
Like if
automatic
you're in your
weapons?
PTA meeting.
Right, like blowing away people with man buns. Like, I haven't seen that happening. Why are we pretending this is about gentrification? And then with the Muncie attack, um, every single article said, there's been these zoning battles between the Hasidic and non-Hasidic residents of this town. And I'm just thinking, first of all, factually irrelevant. In the same article, it mentions that the perpetrator's from a town 45 minutes away. So probably not somebody who was really upset about the zoning. Number two, do we normally resolve municipal disputes with a machete? Like, I left mine at home before the last school board meeting, silly me. These articles, and I just realized, like, these news articles, these articles are sending a signal to the public. And the signal they're sending is that these people deserve it. This is victim blaming. It's the same as, it would be like if you wrote a news article about a woman who was sexually assaulted, and you spend 80% of the article describing what she's wearing. This is exactly the dynamic we're talking about. And what I think it does is it sort of hits up against the point where the flaw in the way a lot of us have taught to fight bigotry in this country. Because, a lot of us in our education were taught this kind of clunky lesson by well-meaning people that, when we were sort of taught, not to be bigots, what they usually told us is like, oh, see this group of people over here who you might be bigoted against? You shouldn't hate those people because they're just like you and me. They're just like everyone else. Mm-hmm. And the problem with this, like the fatal flaw in this argument is the Jews spent 3,000 years not being like everybody else. That's sort of the premise of Judaism, right? I mean, like, uncoolness is like Judaism's brand.
Totally.
Right? I mean, like, the whole rest of the ancient Near East is worshiping, like, Marvel's cinematic universe of sexy deities, and the Jews are, like, losers in the school cafeteria. Like, here's our bossy, unsexy, invisible god, right? Like, we've never been cool. And this is, like, a real fatal flaw in the way we want to live in a pluralistic society if we're saying that the only way somebody should get empathy from you is if they're exactly like you. Because then what you're basically teaching people is that if someone isn't exactly like you, then it's totally fine to hack them with a machete.
Oh my God.
So this dynamic of like, someone has to be just like you goes back to this universalizing principle,
yeah,
which we're immersed in, which is like, we should love everybody because we're all the same. And it's like, this is the key to Jewish identity is Jews have never wanted to be the same.
Can I admit something sort of unrelated that I don't, I realize as we're talking, and I'm just being very honest, right? Like, I have always carried this thing when I read things where I'm like, oh God, this is really bad PR for Jews, right? This feeling when like someone does something that's bad who's Jewish, I'm like, ooh, this is not good for us. Or like when something like that, I literally remember reading when all of that was happening in New York and New Jersey and reading about like the gentrification, all of these things, and I was like, oh my God, like this is bad for like, and I don't know what that is. I don't know if that is this thing that I kind of have intrinsically believed and experienced since childhood, and my parents sort of taught me, which is like they're gonna come and kill you. And I'm so nervous about the attention or the narrative shifting or giving anyone any other reason to be upset. But I can't imagine any other population in the world feels that way to the extent that we do.
Well, so this is actually something that my publishing this book has taught me, because I would have said the same thing before I published this book. Like, oh, this is a really unique experience to Jews where we're like constantly worried about these things. And, yes. What I learned since I published this book is that's not true. Because I now have a lot of non-Jewish readers. And one thing that I very frequently hear from my non-Jewish readers in other non-Jews in other minority communities is, wow, this feels familiar. Wow, this feels familiar. Right? Like, oh, if another person in my group, like, becomes a super famous for doing something horrible, like, this doesn't reflect well, like, those kinds of feelings. Or even just the feelings of, like, this sort of, like, fake pious, worship of people's, like the dead Jews phenomenon. Like I've, had people in the Black community tell me like, oh, everybody's like, yay, Martin Luther King, but like, Black people today, we kind of don't care, right? Or like, I've heard this from, Native Americans who are like, like, oh, look, they named their sports team after us, hooray. Like, and we're supposed to be honored by this instead of insulted. I think what's different in the Jewish community is the trajectory, which does not fit what we think of as Americans. That I think is a major disconnect because, you know, even if you think about like other minority groups in the United States, like there is this idea which might, I mean, I'm not saying this idea is true, but this idea that like, oh, the moral arc of the history is long, but it bends toward justice, that like, you know, things are getting incrementally better all the time, which again, I don't know that that's actually true, but that is sort of like what we expect to happen. Like we expect like, oh, you know, America falls short of this ideal, but we keep trying to get better. It's actually the opposite dynamic in Jewish history. The pattern in Jewish history is much more often that there's a Jewish community that's very, very integrated into a non-Jewish society, and then things change.
Yeah, that's what happened in Iran, right? That's what happened in Germany. That's what happened in all these. I mean, like,
Yeah.
I was always Iranian before I was, we eat Persian food. We were completely assimilated and like very much Iranian in every single part, every facet of our day-to-day life and existence. And then one day it was like, oh no, we're Jewish and only
Everything
Jewish.
changed, and but that pattern is so common, right? I mean, it's so common, right? I mean, like everything you just said was also true, like in 10th century Spain.
Yeah.
Was also true, like, you know, in the Roman period, right? I mean, this like often been true, right? I mean, even like, you know, again, not claiming this is historical, but like in like, you know, the book of Exodus, it's like, or in Genesis and Exodus, it's like Joseph is the second in command of Egypt, and then it's his descendants are enslaved. Like we start at the top. I mean, you know, that
Yeah.
trajectory is like you have an integrated community, and then things change. And I think that dynamic doesn't feel like there's no language for that dynamic in America because that's not the way we think about, you know, minorities and things like that. So that's, you know, whether or not that's accurate to American history is a different question. But like that dynamic feels like weird and unfamiliar to American Jews. But the reality is that that is the dynamic in more often in Jewish history. It's like this is a cyclical thing.
Uh, yes, very much so.
Yeah.
Um, I can't thank you enough. This has been so enlightening. I truly feel like I'm learning so much. Is there anything else, by the way, that you want to talk about or that you feel like we didn't cover?
I mean, the only thing I think is worth mentioning in terms of the dynamic about understanding anti-Semitism is that, again, this is where the American model really doesn't fit because the American model of understanding bigotry is as it's a social prejudice, right? Like you see, it's the, you know, bigotry is about like, oh, there's this group of people who I think are inferior to me, right? And that's like sort of how we were taught in school about prejudice or whatever, right? Um, Anti-Semitism is not really a social prejudice where you think, oh, this group of people is inferior to me. It's it's not a social prejudice. It's a conspiracy theory. And the problem with a conspiracy theory that makes it really different from a social prejudice is that a social prejudice, you think these people are, oh, here's this group of people I think are inferior to me. A conspiracy theory is the opposite. It's here's this group of people I think are superior to me. Right? Like these people are supervillains who are somehow magically, you know, have these superpowers and they're manipulating things behind the scenes, and therefore, like, you know, I'm being righteous by punching up and you know and speaking truth to power and taking these people down, and that's like it just doesn't fit into like the way that we were taught as children to like, you know, fight bigotry, right? Like because it's exactly the opposite, right? It's this like
Wow. Yeah.
whack job belief in a conspiracy theory, and that's like anti-Semitism has always been a conspiracy theory. It's not just like, oh, protocols of the elders in Zion in 1903. It goes back to ancient times. That it's like these people have too much power, too much privilege, and they're overrepresented, and we need to take them down.
Yeah.
That has always been the dynamic of anti-Semitism. So that's why, you know, this whole language of, you know, human rights and, you know, DEI that we keep encountering, that's why that those groups are, I wouldn't say they're inherently anti-Semitic, but that's why those groups are vulnerable to anti-Semitism because the way they understand prejudice does not accommodate this conspiracy theory. Like literally they'll say to you like, oh, you know, you can't be, you know, Jews can't be discriminated against because they're rich. And I'm like, do you get how that's the discrimination is like believing this like bonkers conspiracy theory that like Jews are like rich bankers who are taking over the world? Because that's anti-Semitism. So like that, but that is the conspiracy theory is the anti-Semitism. And I mean, you know, the nice way to say it is people are ignorant of that. They don't understand this dynamic because it doesn't fit what they've been taught. that bigotry looks like.
Wow. I never heard that before.
Yeah.
I had a conversation last week with Hillel Neuer. Do you know him?
Yes. Oh, I think I
Um,
know what you're talking about. Yep.
and he said, he talked about how like anti-Semitism, he said, quote, mutates like a virus, and said that if you look throughout all of history, Jews are being blamed as being the opposite of whatever is most virtuous at the time. So like if
Yes.
it's religion, then we like killed whoever was important to them. If it was, capitalism, then we're communists. If it's communists, then we're capitalists. And now the
Yes.
biggest virtue is, you know, confronting the oppressor. So we are the oppressors, right? And so it's
Yes.
yeah, that was fascinating
So
to me.
right, that's the idea that I mentioned earlier, right?
Yeah.
I'm forgetting whose quote this is. This is not my line. I don't remember who, but it's that it's not that all Jews are evil. It's that all evil is Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
That's the fundamental anti-Semitic belief.
Yeah.
Is this conspiracy theory? Yeah.
You are a gift. Thank you. This has
I mean, I
been,
wish I had I mean, the problem is like people like want me to solve this problem. They're like, so what's your solution to this problem? I am starting to think about like better ways to educate people, not to like solve the problem, but like what I have discovered in sort of traveling around the country and talking about this book is like there's just so much more ignorance than malice,
mm-hmm.
and that's an opportunity.
I agree.
Yeah,
I really
because
do.
there are just like a whole lot of people with a whole lot of goodwill, and there are a lot of people who want to be, in today's language, like good allies and kind of don't know how. And part of the reason they don't know how is because like there's zero education about like even who are Jews. Like nobody knows that. Like you can't like it's like required in your high school history textbook to teach you about the Holocaust, but like it's not required to say like teach people who are Jews.
Mm.
Yeah. And so
Wow.
then all these misconceptions where they're like, "Oh, we're a religious group." I'm like, "Actually, Jews predate the category of religion." Jews predate the category of race, Jews predate the category of nationality, and it's like if you can explain who Jews are, that we are Am Yisrael, part of understanding that is that like here's what makes us Am Yisrael. We're a joinable tribal group with a shared homeland, history, and culture. And so, I mean, you can't tell that story without explaining the centrality of Israel to Jewish identity. But one thing we've never had a chance to do is to explain who we are.
Wow, that's beautiful.
I do think that like there's sort of basic information, sharing this like basic information about like who Jews are. And I actually am doing work right now for something called the Weitzman Museum, which is the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. They're redesigning their whole museum, and part of what they're doing is like creating like resources and curricula to basically just like share with the American public like who are Jews. Because this is like there are a lot of people who are really curious. I mean, that's the other thing I discovered in like speaking about my book in a lot of different places. Like people actually want to know and they're really curious, and like
Wow.
no one's telling them. Because like people get, if they're curious about this, like what are they going to do? Google Jews, right? Like that's going to go well, right? So but like then there isn't like but part of the reason why people are falling for these conspiracy theories is because like nobody's offering them any other information, and not information to debunk the conspiracy theory, information about like the reality of like what does
Yeah,
it
yeah,
mean to be
yeah,
Jewish.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yes.
not like, oh, here's why the conspiracy theory is wrong. How about like just the starting point of like who
100%.
are
Yeah,
Jews?
that's literally
Who are
101.
Jews? If they're not evil bakers who are taking over the world, then who are they? It's like, well, let me explain this to you, because then otherwise they're just like, oh, it's a religion, and it's like the weird part about that is like there's like millions of secular Jews. Like I've never met a secular Mormon.
Yeah.
Like we're not a religion, the way that our neighbors think that of a religion. Like we're not that. We're an
Wow.
And you have to explain what it means to be what does it mean to be Yisrael?
Do you want to take, is there a 1 minute version of that or no?
Yes, well, so like my one sentence version of this is, you know, Jews are actually a type of social grouping that was actually very common in the ancient Near East, and it just happens to not be common in the West today. This is a joinable, so joinable is important because you can become Jewish. Jews are a joinable tribal group with a shared history, homeland, and culture. Part of that culture is a non-universalizing religion. Non-universalizing mean meaning we don't proselytize, we don't need anybody else to become Jewish. Everybody can be a wonderful person and, live a great life, and, nobody needs to be Jewish to do those things. Um, so that's who we are, and it's what I just said was a paragraph in English, and in Hebrew it's one word that's 2 letters long, which is Am. We are
Wow.
Am Yisrael. We are the people of Israel. And that, I mean, I think that we felt in, since these attacks, like, it's been really obvious that Am Yisrael is real, because all of us around the world, it's not just like, oh, I feel emotionally connected. Like, we are physically and actually connected. Like, we're all like maybe 3 steps removed from one of these people who was murdered. Maybe 3 steps.
Yeah, I was
I
gonna
mean,
say.
it's like, such a close relationship. It's an ongoing relationship among Jews around the world. And it's not just that ongoing relationship. It's like we were all doing the same thing that weekend, right? Which was like, we all have this holiday that were celebrating in one version or the other. Some people, it's a national holiday, so it's free time, and they were at a rave. And some people, it's, more traditional minded, and we're using this to read the Torah. But like, this is, this, like, we share the days of our lives, right? We share this calendar, we share this language, and we share this centrality of the land of Israel. That is like, is it possible to have a Judaism that has nothing to do with Israel? I mean, not really, because like all of our holidays are even just about like the weather in Israel.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Like, one of the things we did on this, like, the day when this attack happened is Shmini Atzeret, which is the day we pray for rain. I
Yeah.
mean, here in New Jersey, it might have been pouring rain on that day, but in Israel, that's when the rains begin. Right? It's like, we celebrate, this New Year for the trees, celebrating the almond blossoms, that bloom in February. I live in New Jersey. Nothing's blooming in February, but here I am celebrating the blooming of the trees. Like, it's like the whole thing is based on this place.
Wow. Yes.
Like,
A
all of it is
thousand.
based on this place. Like, you can't get out. I mean, Passover is, yes, it's this liberation story, but it's also like Chag HaAviv. It's the holiday of spring. I live in New Jersey. Lots of times we're digging out the snow to celebrate Passover. Like, it's not designed to be here. It
Yeah.
doesn't make sense here. So, I mean, there's so many things like that. So, and I think that, like, I mean, almost every Jew on the planet has felt this in these most recent attack. It's like you feel it and it affects you. And I just think that that's people don't realize, like, this isn't like some mythology. Like, this is a reality of our lives.
Yeah. Very, very like deep in every fiber of our being.
Yes, and even just practically, like, in terms of, like, yeah, like, we all know people there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Truly,
Thank
thank
you.
you. This has
So
been
this
so
is great to
enlightening.
meet you.